A few months ago, I asked my dean here at Santa Barbara City College if I could add a couple of lectures, like a little module of teaching on cannabis cultivation into the plant propagation class. And I've talked with him about it on and off for the last few years, and it's always been kind of the political climate of the college that because it's federally illegal, but legal in the state of California, that it still wasn't the best thing to get into, because it was still federally illegal. But things are changing, and more and more people are cultivating cannabis for themselves or even commercially. We've seen the transformation of the city of Carpinteria from a cut flower industry for the last 75 years to now it's almost all cannabis. And more dispensaries and things like that. So yeah, he said it would be fine, and maybe at some point we'll have a full course in cannabis cultivation. But I got interested in teaching it for a few reasons, and one of them was that I think it's important for our students that might want to enter this industry. And it is actually a pretty growing market. I wasn't convinced that it was a whole new market for employment, because I thought, well, all the people that used to just do cut flowers are now doing cannabis, in the sense that maybe not the exact same people, but that not a lot of new jobs were created by cannabis growing. But I talked to a few growers, and I did some research with other people growing it and other teachers around the state that were teaching about it, and I was proven that I was wrong. It actually is a much bigger market, employment market, for a couple of reasons. One, cannabis packing and processing requires a lot more jobs than cut flowers. So cannabis isn't people just don't cut off the stems and send them to Trader Joe's for a nice bouquet of cannabis buds. They actually have to remove the buds and process it, and there's a lot of things that are involved with the processing and harvesting, which is, so that requires more labor, more employment. And also cannabis is a flower, it flowers year round, and it can be grown year round. So that requires a lot more jobs all year round, whereas the cut flower industry really was, to distill it down, it was focused just on, Mother's Day, and then a few other holidays, Christmas, or around the winter holiday, there'd be a lot of sales of certain types of plants, and Mother's Day. So it really was very seasonal. So cannabis is a stronger market. It's a more stable market. It's a more year-round market, and it requires a lot more people. So it really is important for you students to understand about this industry that's up and coming as a potential job place. So also, cannabis is a really pretty easy plant to propagate. It's got a lot of interesting aspects to it as far as its propagation goes. So it illustrates almost all the other types of propagation that we've been talking about. So yeah, let's get into it. And I will make the disclaimer that I am not a cannabis grower and never have been a cannabis grower. I am learning with you along with you with all this stuff. So I have this lecture I put together from people I spoke with, some research, and a textbook I'm using. And I'm presenting it as here's what I'm learning. I'm not saying this is what I've done and that I know. So a lot of you will have tips and things that you've done yourself, and you may find some of the things I present as, oh, maybe that doesn't really work when you really try it. It sounds good in a book. That's great. I mean, the more you bring of your knowledge to, the richer this experience can be for you. So I'm going to be sharing all the things I've learned, and you can add to that maybe in some of the discussion forums, or even in in-person class. We can talk more about it, and we can all learn together. Here we go. Cannabis is technically an annual plant, although in some more temperate climates and even tropical, it can grow more than 1 year. It's dioecious, meaning it has separate male and female plants. A male plant would have all and only male flowers, and a female plant would have only female flowers on it. Thus, there are male and female plants. The leaves are palmately compound. Most people know how to recognize one. average of 7 to 9 leaflets that have serrated edges. The leaves are opposite on the lower parts of the plant and alternate on the main stem. So flowers, like I said, are male or female. Some hermaphrodites do occur. And bracts are a leaf-like structure that encloses and kind of protects the female flower. Those are the ones that have resinous glands on them that produce the high concentration of cannabinoids. So the female flowers are the ones that are humans like to maximize their size and all the different qualities they're trying to use by the breeding and propagation of these. And it's wind pollinated in nature, but humans have been propagating this and caring for it for thousands of years. So humans often, if they're doing some kind of experimentation or want to have seed production, they will pollinate them by hand. So cannabinoids themselves are pretty interesting. There's been different theories about why this plant has and produces these cannabinoids like THC. Some might say that it was put on Earth to help sedate and relax and give people a high, but cannabis has been around a lot longer than humans. So it has, as far as we know, had this THC producing or cannabinoid producing qualities and abilities during its evolutionary life. So it was here before us, so it wasn't meant just for humans. So what are maybe some of the other ecological functions of these cannabinoids produced by cannabis? Some of them are, it has antifungal properties against a particular cannabis pathogen, so it keeps that plant from being infected by this one fungi. It protects it from ultraviolet radiation, possibly. That's a theory. It does have, cannabinoids are insecticidal, so they do prevent insects from eating that plant too. They are not something an insect wants to ingest. They can be toxic to an insect. And those resinous hairs or trichomes form, because they're kind of sticky, they also have, they form another mechanical defense against insect herbivory or insect damage. Also, the cannabinoids are known to help prune, and they cause cell death, and they can concentrate in the lower leaves, and they can be the compound that helps those lower leaves fall off and thus prunes itself by using those chemicals. And potentially, because those chemicals are herbicidal, those cannabinoids, they also might serve as a function to keep other plants from growing underneath that plant. Those leaves drop down, and then other plants have a harder time growing there. So those are some of the ideas. And as you might know, the female flower is the place where these resinous trichomes and resin ducts are produced. And so that's where all the cannabinoids are produced, namely THC. But they're only produced until that female flower gets pollinated. So older theories I heard from reading a book called The Botany of Desire was that these cannabinoids were to attract pollinators. But that really wouldn't make sense if they're wind pollinated. So the jury's still out on that. But it made sense in the way that these resins are produced until it's pollinated. And then once that female flower has been pollinated with some pollen from a male flower, a male plant, it stops producing those, and the whole flower starts to change and kind of senesce or die out, start to die back. So if you're growing it, like humans mostly do, for its cannabinoids, you want to prevent pollination, and you want to have only female plants and no male plants around. It could be that those cannabinoids, they weren't trying to attract a pollinator, but they were trying to protect that flower. So they're concentrated there to protect that flower against maybe fungal or insect or even bacterial infection, and until it was pollinated, just to ensure that that flower got pollinated. And then once the flower got pollinated, they didn't need to protect it anymore. So that could be why. Some real interesting aspects to this plant. Two main subspecies of cannabis, and that's sativa and indica. And there's also varieties, the Kush varieties, they're sometimes called Afghani. And these cannabis plants are wild, native wild, almost all over the world, not really in North America, but in lots of places. So they are equatorial, wild in the equator zone, the tropical zone, and even in some temperate zones too. So some of the plants like the Cannabis indica originated in lower latitudes, that's more around the equator, and they have less variation within their population. So there's less variation in THC production in their buds than some of the cannabis sativa plants that originated at the higher latitudes, like in the temperate climates. So it's thought to be that the weather patterns, if they're more consistent, the plants are less variable in their THC production. And if the plants are native to a climate that's more variable, then the THC production also varies throughout the seasons and year. There's some interesting just data on it in that little table below: the height, shape, nodes, color, flowering, and even effect. Some of the places cannabis is native to: Afghanistan, India, Colombia, Mexico, Thailand, Vietnam, Equatorial Africa, and other places. Beginning in the 1970s, the varieties were crossbred quite a bit when the market really took off. So some of the first domesticated varieties were formed at that time, but there's many, many more now. The typical life cycle of the cannabis plant, not different than lots of other plants, but it's an annual, so it happens pretty quickly. Within just a few minutes of that seed being exposed to water, it will start to produce those hormones for growth. Within a couple of weeks, it's a small seedling. Within 2 to 8 weeks, it has a lot of vegetative growth, and then around 6 to 8 weeks, it starts to flower. And at that point, right at the early part of that point, you would be able to sex or identify which gender that plant is that you have. Often the males are not kept, but the females are. And then harvesting usually takes place after week 9 at some point. And a similar life cycle description here with a little more detail on what happens in the very beginning part, the first few days and weeks. Some of the same information as the last slide, but a little bit more detail. One thing to notice too is any cannabis grower would know about is really paying attention, of course, near the flowering time. One, to sex the plants and not keep the males. If you're growing them from seed, you would definitely want to not keep the males anywhere near the females, or not keep them at all. If you're growing them from clones, then just starting to watch for the flower growth, and you'll be wanting to understand how to know when they're peaking in their cannabinoid production. At what point are they peaking? It swelled to their near bursting with those trichomes and glands. There's just a very short window when they're at their peak, and after that they start to lose their cannabinoids. They start to be degraded, and the flower starts to die. But before that, they're not at their full capacity. So that's a temporal thing that you really want to watch and dial in. So there are lots of different climatic or environmental conditions that you'll want to provide for your cannabis plants. If you're growing them outside, they are a plant that is, even though they've been highly bred and cultivated for thousands of years, they still remain true to their wild type in the sense that full, bright sunlight is their best type of sun. So that's what they like. If you can grow them outside and it doesn't draw any attention or suspicion, it's the cheapest way to do it. It's also the most environmentally, conservative way. You're not using any extra resources or electricity or lights or materials. If you have an area where you're growing them and in the summer it's nice and full sun, but then in the fall it starts to get some shade, you'll want to supplement light to give them, keep them up to a high light amount. If you have partial shade, somewhere outside, it's usually enough for a lot of buds to mature. It might not maximize their production, but if there's little direct light in the winter at all, then you'll need some supplemental light to overcome that or if you're in an area where it's overcast a lot or the angle of the sun is really low, like at the higher latitudes, you'll need to supplement light. And there's lots of different ways to produce artificial light to supplement the sun's light, or just use fully artificial light. They need about 5 or more hours of bright sun a day, and you can make sure you achieve that using different types: fluorescent lights, compact fluorescent, metal halide lights, something that gives similar to what you would give to like a reptile for the UVB spectrum, things like that. And in general, you'll want to supplement low light levels with about 20 to 30 watts per square foot for about 5 hours a day in those times of the year, perhaps when you don't have full bright sunlight most of the day. But most people will be growing them indoors. A lot of commercial growers do not. They grow them outside or in greenhouses. I know, so Carpinteria, of course, has tons of glass houses or greenhouses where cannabis is grown. So that's using the natural light. But then many people will grow them themselves in smaller areas or more private areas too, where they need more artificial lighting. I know Camarillo, in that area, is where a lot of hemp cannabis is grown, and that's all in the ground outside. You can see it just driving by. So most people are going to be growing it indoors, or a lot of people. And if you do that, you need to have really bright indoor lighting for them. The sativas require the most light. Sativa indica hybrids are going to require the next brightest, down to indicas, which require the least. But most varieties will do well with about 2,000 to 5,000 foot candles. So that's a measurement of the intensity of light that you have to learn how to do and measure and make sure you're getting the right amount if you're doing, especially if you're doing it all indoors, like there's no natural light coming in. Again, fluorescent lights, high pressure sodium lights are really good, a little more expensive. Compact fluorescents are good for concentrating light in one small area because they're small. You can get a lot of them in one area. Metal halide lights have been used. They're not as common anymore now that people are using the HPS. But those are all things to think about. So these environmental conditions are general, but just to get you started thinking about what you might need to provide. All plants use carbon dioxide in the photosynthetic process. They absorb it through their leaves, through the stomata, which are pores on the underside of the leaves. And together with the water that comes up through the roots and the energy from the sun, they're able to take the carbons off of carbon dioxide and put them into 6 carbon sugars and produce food for themselves. That's photosynthesis. So if you, not all plants, but most plants, if you enrich the atmosphere with more carbon dioxide, they will increase their photosynthetic rate. And so if you're growing cannabis, it's a great idea too. If they have full light in the summer, if they're outside or even inside in a greenhouse or inside in a growth chamber, if you have really bright light, you can, and you may want to supplement the atmosphere with more CO2, like with a CO2 tank, and that will increase their growth rate and their body size will, the plant's body will grow bigger and they'll store more sugars and they'll have more energy to put towards flowering. Water, of course, they all require water. They are plants. And main thing with water, if you're growing these in an artificial situation, is to, like a hydroponic, you're going to make sure that the pH level is accurate for the cannabis. So if you're doing a hydroponic, you want your pH to be about 5.6 to 6.3, and it can be a little bit higher if you are growing them in the soil, like in the ground. It can be 5.8 to 6.5, so a little more towards the alkaline. Make sure your water is dechlorinated if possible. If you're doing it outside in the soil, you want to keep those good soil microbes alive, and they will be killed by the chlorine that's put into our water to kill human pathogens. So it's counterproductive, though, if you're using that water on the garden. If you've ever been to a cannabis grower's store, there's just a bajillion different products out there for fertilizing your cannabis, for hydroponic systems, for in-ground systems, growth systems. There's just lots of great things out there. Just make sure you're giving them enough of the macronutrients, the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, as well as broad a spectrum of the micronutrients as possible. Organic fertilizers are the way to go, especially, of course, because this is an ingested crop, so it's something that people will put into their bodies, so you want it to be completely organic. I mean, unless you're growing it just for hemp. So you want to use organic fertilizers too. Compost teas work really well for this kind of situation. And just check it out. Go to a local grower store, look online, and you'll see all the different kinds of products out there. And then run those by someone you know that's a grower, and maybe ask them what they use, and you'll be able to figure that out. You might run into some nutrient deficiencies while you're growing your cannabis, and deficiencies will show up in different ways in plants. Some nutrients are mobile within the plant, and those mobile nutrients like nitrogen, you'll see the deficiency show up first in the oldest leaves, because as a plant grows, it will move those mobile nutrients from the older sections to the newer growing sections. And so the older sections will become depleted of that nutrient first. But then there are nutrients that are non-mobile. They don't move around. Once they get brought into the plant and become part of the tissues, they cannot be translocated or moved anywhere else. And you'll see those nutrient deficiencies show up in the new growth. So you can check out these different leaf symptoms and how they look and what types of nutrients they indicate are deficient. Wild cannabis plants are native to areas that are either tropical or a little higher latitude temperate areas. So they like a warm climate. 70 to 85 degrees is maximal and optimal, and you don't want it to be too high above that or too far below. So they're not native to or adapted to climates that get extremes. So keep that temperature around that, and you will be maximizing the metabolic rate if you do that. If you're going to take the temperature, though, in your growth area, your growth chamber, your greenhouse, or even outside, make sure you're not taking the temperature just kind of in the middle of the garden or having your thermometer on the side wall of your little growth chamber, because you want to know the temperature in near the roots or even in the soil, and the temperature right in the canopy, like right amongst all the leaves. That's where the temperature is affecting the metabolic rate. So that's where you want that temperature to be 70 to 85 degrees, right in there. Humidity is important too. Cannabis is a moderate humid type of plant. It likes it right around 50% relative humidity. Drier areas can make negative growth effects, as can too humid of areas. If you want to keep the humidity from being too high, you can provide just ventilation. That's pretty easy with fans or opening the door now and then, or a swamp cooler if it's really dry to humidify the air. And be careful of dust and dirt blowing into your area or garden. There's usually negative ions can attract dust and form dust particles, which can lay on the leaves and reduce your growth, and especially the growth of the buds. So now let's get into more about the actual growing of the plants, not just the background biology. Of course, you can do this by clones, just cuttings shown on the left into something like a rock wool, and then the genetics are maintained and the sex is maintained as well. So if you have all female plants, and that's all you want to keep doing, you can just take clones off of that stem cuttings. On the right, you're seeing a seedling. So you can see the two cotyledons, those little round oval-shaped embryonic leaves, and then the true leaves, the serrated ones coming out. And of course, with seeds, you're going to have variation, genetic variation. There are advantages to using clones, asexual propagation. You know the specific characteristics of the plant and what you're going to get. There are usually more varieties of clones available than seed, and information, there's more out there on the clones, and you don't have to sex the plants. You know that they're female plants when you get the clones. Some of the disadvantages of growing cannabis by using clones is the plants are less vigorous overall than plants grown from seed, and that's pretty much true for all plants. The less mature stage you can get the plant, the stronger it will be overall. Meaning, like if you're going to plant a tree, to give you an extreme, it's better to plant a seed of that tree in the ground, like an acorn. That tree that will that oak tree will be much stronger as it grows and reach a larger size at maturity than one grown from, let's say, like a 24-inch box that you bought an oak tree in and planted that in the ground. It's pretty interesting too that if you take a tree that is in a 24-inch box and you take another one that's much older and bigger in, like, let's say a 36-inch box, these big boxes that you buy trees in, and you put them both in the ground, and immediately the 36-inch box tree is quite a bit bigger. But over a few years, the one that you planted in the 24-inch box in the smaller pot size to begin with will get much bigger and overtop the size of the one that was originally older and larger. And that is just because their root systems develop better when they are developed in the ground from seed or from smaller maturity levels. So back to the cannabis, yeah, the cloning growth, those clones are going to be less vigorous overall than grown from seed. Of course, you might with the seed, unless the seed has already been sexed, you're going to have a problem with getting some males in there. The roots on clones do not form a taproot. That's one of the reasons they're not as vigorous, whereas opposed to the seeds will form a taproot. Some of the clones can carry diseases that are endemic in the cannabis industry, and that's a problem you've got to be careful for. And in general, clones are more susceptible to pests and diseases. They're not as vigorous. And they also tend to flower very quickly after you get them in the ground, even without 12 hours of daylight. They can do it with much less, and that's not something you want. When you're selecting clones that you want to take and grow, be careful and thoughtful about it. Take healthy ones only. Take ones that have the white roots, not any kind of brown or black roots. No pests are visible, green, healthy leaves. Ask people you know that grow and find out their tips on getting really good clones if you're able to select the ones that you're taking. Rock wool is a good place to root them in and quarantine those. Don't put them in with the rest of yours for a couple of weeks until you know that they're disease-free and they're doing well. Transplanting those clones after they get some healthier root system into 4-inch or 1-gallon pots is good. Let the water completely go away. Let the soil dry out completely between waterings. And you can leave that clone in the rock wool cube that you got it in, or that you put it in and it started to really root. Just leave it in there and plant that in your potting mix, and plant that kind of level so the crown of the plant remains the same where it was in the rock wool cube. You want to have that same surface level the same inside the potting soil too. Anytime you have some of this wet potting soil up against stem tissue, it could cause fungal disease and rotting. Kind of the DIY of cloning, you can take a cutting yourself and root it in a cup of water. You can also take a larger, woodier cutting from, it's not really true wood, they are annuals, but thicker, harder, a little bit browner cutting, and just stick that directly into soil in a 1-gallon pot. Keep it shaded, water it every few days. It should root. These are not hard plants to get to root. They're very foolproof as far as cuttings go. The tricky part is the flowering and all of that part. Really dialing that in so you know exactly when you're getting the buds and the maximizing the cannabinoids. But getting the cuttings going is pretty much the easy part. Cuttings need to be taken by at least, the latest May and June to have time to produce roots and grow to a decent size before they flower in August and before the light starts going away and temperatures start going down. That is if you're doing it outside. But you can grow it inside year-round. The advantages of propagating cannabis by seed are, like I said before, larger, stronger, more vigorous plants overall. You'll get more yield per plant because it's bigger and more vigorous. It's more pest and disease resistant. Could be less expensive depending on where you're buying your seeds from. I've purchased seeds from Kaya Gene, and they're affordable. Find out what kind of plant it'll turn into. It's fun to see like something go from a seed and turn into a big, few foot tall plant. That's always really rewarding process rather than from a cutting. But of course, the disadvantages of propagating by seed or genetic variation. There's very few stable seed lines where you keep getting the same characteristics over and over in the progeny. It's different than like wildflower and vegetable seeds that seem to stay pretty true over time. They've been able to really, focus on that with these seed companies. But with cannabis, you're dealing with the thing you're trying to get. The product is sensitive to lots of factors. So the genetics, if they change a little bit, you can get a different product pretty easily. Takes longer, of course, to grow the plant from seed, so you need to plan for that. And you're going to have to get rid of the male plants unless you want more seeds. And usually you don't want the male plants because if you're going to have them, you need it really in a controlled situation because you've decided you want to try pollination and fertilization. But most of the time you do not want to do that. How to source seeds. How I did it is I called a few people that I know and asked them at the Headwaters Growers in Carpinteria was one of them, and I spoke with them about where they got seeds from, and I told them I was looking for hemp seed because that's all we can grow on campus right now. And they led me to a researcher who's working with hemp who told me about, she works at Cal Poly and Allen Hancock College, and she told me about a grower and a seed provider that she uses, and I've gone through them to get our seeds. So talking to people is the best thing. Of course, ordering from cannabis seed companies, there's quite a few. Just storing seeds is very similar to the way we store other seeds. Cool, dry area in the fridge is fine. Germination rates will fall, but not for a couple of years, so it's possible to keep them and store them for a while. There's something called feminized seeds. Some female plants will produce male flowers if those plants have not been pollinated late in the flowering cycle. You'll get some of the male flowers produced on them. Remember, this is a female plant, so it does not have any of the Y chromosome in that sense, so it really only has XX. The seeds are XX. They're still female. So that's something to think about. But those plants that have that tendency also will pass that tendency on to the next generation. So you may end up with some more male flowers in the progeny of that plant. There are nurseries, of course, where you can purchase these. Dark Heart Nursery is one where you can get cannabis seedlings and seeds. Most of the nursery seedlings are sold in like 6-packs or 3-inch pots, just like you buy spring flowers in. And the instructions for growing cannabis from seed aren't horribly different than the general rules for growing any seed. Bury the seeds about 2 times their diameter underground. And if they're too deep, they won't be able to germinate, but they need to be underneath the soil too. They don't need light to germinate. Rarely do seeds need light, so this is a pretty normal type of seed. Usually there's no treatment needed. The seeds they break their dormancy and they start to germinate, the germination process as soon as they are taking in water. Older seeds may benefit from being soaked overnight or scarified, scratched and scuffed up a bit to let that seed coat be permeable. And bottom heat is helpful for seed germination or speeding up the germination process. Make sure you put the cannabis seeds in the correct position. So seed is properly positioned with the pointed end up, as you see in the picture. And the taproot will split the seed case, emerge, and curl downward. The seed is not properly positioned when the pointed end is pointed down. It will get a little confused and the radical or that root will come out and start to go upward and then go back downward and waste a little bit of time. So point up is how you plant the seed. If you're going to try to sex cannabis plants because you've been growing some from seed in early spring, they typically start showing their gender or their sex characteristics in late June or July. They form what's called pre-flowers, and the males produce more typical looking pendant, like hanging flower. They start as little balls at the nodes. The males should be removed, of course, the whole cutting or whole plant before the flowers open. You don't want it to produce pollen. And in general, the males will exhibit less branching and be more upright than the females. So you growers who have done this, And those of you who are going to try it will learn by doing it and kind of getting a feel for what that means. You know, what's relatively more upright or more branching. It depends on the variety, but it also just depends on you doing it and understanding what that means on the ground. Here's an image of a 4-month-old cannabis plant that is just becoming noticeably male. The first male flowers are seen behind that little green stipule, that little piece of tissue that's protecting the emerging male flower. And here's another image even closer up showing you that early emerging male flower. You want to know that because those plants you want to get rid of for the most part. And here's an image of a 4 to 5 month old female plant, a little bit older than the male. The male flowers come out first usually. These are the first female flowers, and they produce these whitish hair-like pistils that kind of looks like little fingers sticking out. Pretty different than the stipule, which was more straight on the male plant, and different than the actual immature male flower, which didn't have those long kind of finger-like things poking out. Again, you'll get pretty familiar with this as you grow them. There are places that you can have your plants sexed by sending them some of the leaf tissue. It's not cheap, but it can be very quick if you're learning and you're doing large volume and you want to make sure that you don't have any males in there to ruin your whole crop.